Good evening. My name is My name is Neka Eze. I'm currently the president of the Harvard Black Students Association, which is an undergraduate association at Harvard College. I would like to welcome you to the Harvard Black Students Association's first event of Black History Month. We have a number of events planned for the month, including our second annual BSA Formal, and a final banquet at which we are honoring Mark H. Morial, the president and CEO of the National Urban League. But tonight, we are excited to kick off this month with such an amazing panel. Each of these distinguished panelists comes with a laundry list of accomplishments that I will let Professor Ogletree present to you. What I will do is welcome you into the Black Students Association family. The Harvard Black Students Association was founded in 1969 with the purpose of establishing a sense of community among Black students. The BSA endeavors to promote interaction among Black students at Harvard College and to promote interaction among all members of the Harvard community. In addition, the BSA strives to provide a forum for the open expression of political, social, and cultural views. We hope that the forum this evening will allow for such expression. Over the past few months, the Harvard Black Students Association, in conjunction with the Institute of Politics, has formulated this panel. Before I introduce Professor Ogletree, a few thank yous are in order. First and foremost, we must thank the Institute of Politics and its director, Governor Jean Shaheen. We hope that we are given many opportunities to work together with the Institute of Politics in the future. Next, I must thank the Chisholm Group, the W.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research, and the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice for their support of this event. Last but definitely not least, I must thank Aisha Dennis and Christina Wells and the members of their panel committee, and of course the other members of this year's executive board of the Harvard Black Students Association. I'm sure that you are all familiar with his work, so without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Charles Ogletree, Jesse Clemenco Professor of Law and Director of the Charles Hamilton Institute for Race and Justice at the Harvard Law School. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming to another of the many wonderful and engaging forums here at the Kennedy School. We have an outstanding panel that will share their views on this very interesting and timely topic. In addition to that, as we always do here, there will be times for questions and answers. And I see that there are not just undergraduates and graduate students, there's some law students who I know have a difficulty asking questions rather than making speeches. So tonight we're going to try the idea of a question with the idea that the panelists will try to give you an answer as well. And we'll have a dialogue among ourselves, a conversation for a short while, and then we'll open it up to you. And there are microphones here on the floor, and there's usually microphones upstairs as well, and I'll alternate the various approaches to go to you. But I'll let you know about 5 minutes before we start the questions when you can start lining up for the questions. Let me introduce these terrific panelists. To my immediate left is John Mccorder, who I've known for many, many years. He has a PhD from my alma mater, Stanford University, in linguistics. He also taught for many years at the University of Berkeley in California. He now is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he specializes, as he always by his training, in language change, language contact, and concentration issues of race, ethnicity, and cultural issues. In addition to his current book, which is called Winning the Race, Beyond the Crisis in Black America, he's also written a book called The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language, and other books as well. And his writings have appeared in places such as the New Republic, New York Times, and Wall Street Journal, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. Please join me in welcoming Professor John Mccorder. And certainly the award for traveling the furthest to be here goes to Professor Mary Patillo, who joins us today. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago. She is the Arthur Anderson Teaching and Research Professor and Associate Professor of Sociology of African American Studies at Northwestern University. Her books include Black Picket Fences, Privilege and Peril Among the Black Middle Class, which won the American Sociological Association Award for the Oliver Cromwell Cox Best Book Award. And she has research that engages and explores issues of race, ethnicity, with an emphasis on class stratification, urban sociology, and qualitative methods. And we're very pleased that she's joined us today from Chicago. Please welcome Professor Patillo. And finally, I'm sure many of his students are in the audience, either cheering or booing, depending on your grade last semester. We're very happy to have Professor Tommy Shelby, who's written books including, those are the ones who got the A's, huh? All right. His books include We Who Are Dark, Philosophical Foundations of Black Solidarity, and Blackness and Blood, Interpreting African American Identity. His PhD was received from the University of Pittsburgh in the field of philosophy. He also taught at Ohio State University before coming to Harvard University, where he is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences and of African and African American Studies here. And he has been teaching here since 2000 and is known as a very prominent philosopher and political theorist. Please welcome Professor Tommy Shelby. The topic we're talking about tonight is the Black Community United, exploring political unity and the class divide. And it comes at a propitious time. And one particular moment that I want to cite that most of us might have witnessed yesterday, but many of us heard about now, was the memorial service and funeral for Coretta Scott King in Atlanta. It was remarkable that this major event in a mega church, over 10,000 people, that was unthinkable 40 years ago. It was a largely mixed crowd of blacks and whites. It had all the political drama in many respects of a church event. It had 4 presidents there. And it says some things about our community and where we are and where we're going. And the question, sorry, Professor Mccorder, to what extent from the civil rights movement to where we are now, has the black community really changed in the last 40 years from your research and perspective?
Well, when you see someone pass like Mrs. King, what you find yourself thinking is that she comes from a time when activism in the black community was very targeted, and when you saw the theatrical aspects of what activism meant on the civil rights scene before about 1966, it was for a particular purpose. The idea was to present programs for political change in detail to the powers that be, or beed. And King and the gang played figures against each other. They sometimes accepted compromises out of the idea that incremental change is better than no change at all. Since then, we've generally lacked that kind of focus, and I think that the reason that a lot of people have been left behind is in part because often one can lose sight of the fact that acting up is not activism. And so if you are going to act up, it's going to be in order to create a particular change in the world as it is, for better or for worse. We see less of that. And so with first King's birthday and then his wife passing on, I found myself thinking that we're celebrating her, but I wish that what was going on in her era went on more now, and I'm afraid that it doesn't.
Let me ask you, Professor Patillo, have we changed that much, and is it for the worse as opposed to for the better in 40 years?
It's funny that you ask me that question in that way, because I was going to actually take your question and change it a little bit into the ways in which there are some continuities. Because while I think we think about the civil rights era and the era of Dr. King and Coretta Scott King as an era of focus, much of the historical research suggests that there were similar kinds of disagreements among the black leadership at that time. If you just recently, I think Taylor Branch's book has brought the civil rights movement to the north and started to study that. But there have been many books. There's a book called Northern Protest about the civil rights movement in Chicago. And when you look at, for example, the Eyes on the Prize series about when King came to Chicago, the black political leadership in Chicago, there were some black ministers who wouldn't even allow him to come to their church, first of all. And then you had other black leaders who, when King acquiesced to Mayor Daley's somewhat ceremonious signing of what Mayor Daley would do to end slums, which was what the campaign was in Chicago, when King, many leaders thought he acquiesced, black leaders in Chicago said, that's not enough. And they marched in Cicero without the blessing of King and SCLC. And so I think when we look historically, some of that focus was not as crystal clear as it might seem today. So I think I see those continuities And so we might lament that we've lost that focus, but I think if we think realistically about how the civil rights movement went forward, there were a lot of disagreements at that time as well.
Professor Shelby, let me ask you, is there any sense this progress has shown a divide in our community? Is there a real division between what we consider the working class African American community and the more middle class African American community? And if so, is that a problem, or is that a natural process of change?
Well, I think there definitely is a divide. There's a fair amount of distrust, I think, between middle class, especially educated blacks, and working class, or even members of the ghetto poor, if you like. There's I think a lot of resentment and antagonism between the two groups, and there are reasons for that. I mean, some of it has to do with a feeling on the part of the worst off, say, in the community, that those better off don't identify with them as strongly as they used to, that they blame them when they don't do as well as those who do well. There's a sense that those who are really advancing, say, because of access to education, higher education especially, that they want to sort of distance themselves from those who aren't doing as well, or embarrassed by them. And I think that kind of tension makes it very difficult to build strong bonds. So I think those are the kinds of things that have to be mended, and both sides have a role to play in trying to mend that, I think.
Let me ask you more generally, any of the panelists, is there a danger in our discussing this as if it's an issue that has something to do with race? Is it at all surprising that poor people are envious of wealthy people, that the poor class is envious of the middle class? And why is it significant that we talk about in the context of race, the community divide? There is a separation, isn't there, on class, and why are we talking about it as if it's a problem or something of significance?
Well, I think, if our presence here is an illustration, I think, and all of our work is an illustration of our commitment to some kind of change and improvement and goals of social justice for African Americans. And so with that perhaps shared goal, but diverse means to reaching that goal, then there needs to be some basis upon which to get people moving in a similar direction, if not everybody in the same direction. And I think that's why the issues of class stratification in the black community become heightened for African Americans who need to find some road that many of us can get on. And that's why I think it's less salient for whites who don't have that same need for racial justice, because the racial kind of scales are tipped in their favor thus far.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because if you look historically, there's been an odd relationship between poor whites and middle-class whites, sort of a sense of agreement. That is, even though poor whites were treated in some sense as bad as blacks during the period of segregation, they would rather align on the issues of race than on class, right? I mean, the whole idea is that here in Boston, that whites objected to the idea of black children going to the poor schools in South Boston and Charlestown, even though that might have been a good idea in some sense. Why is the issue of black stratification discussed and different, or is it different than the issue of white stratification when it comes to poor and rich? Professor Mccorder?
Well, there's also, I think, a certain tension in that people who are poor or who have been left behind are often feeling that when it comes to the middle class, that we must realize that because of racism, we are still oppressed too, even if we're middle class or we're affluent, and that if we don't realize that, then it means that, one, we don't understand ourselves, and that we don't have a sufficient understanding of the conditions that affect the poor. Within the middle class, I think the the issue of helping those who were left behind is also informed by a sense that we never really become middle class. And this is something that comes partly from the idea that we're often given that even if you are a middle-class black person, your daily life is still about encounters with racism, and then there's also the glass ceiling in many industries and things like that. So it seems that it's a more fraught issue because becoming a middle-class black person is not as easy and does not involve the same kinds of easy transformations that perhaps it has for most white groups.
And I think the visibility of black poverty is another thing that keeps the issue of class stratification on the table. Its visibility not just in the media, which I think we all recognize, but its visibility to middle-class black folk in their own families, in their own neighborhoods, in their churches, as they go grocery shopping. So I think that kind of visibility, immediacy, keeps on the table the reality that there remains a significant racial inequities.
Professor Sherman, let me ask you just from this context, in a sense playing the role of the devil's advocate. If we look at the pre-Brown period, and we're talking about 50 years ago, we were stuck. We could not easily become PhDs in the fields that all of you have PhDs. It was very hard. If you want to be a teacher, it's fine. Doctor, lawyer, a little harder. You know, a professor at a major institution, very difficult. And that changed. The doors were open. Opportunities were created. Why is there any responsibility, or is there, for those who have worked hard, had the success, achieved some degree of prestige, any obligation to be concerned about the community from whence one came? Where does that come from? Or is there an obligation?
I think that there is. I think that, if you thought that the reason why poor blacks aren't doing as well didn't have anything to do with racism, you probably, we would be framing this thing very differently, right? If you thought, I don't think it's, you can't explain it entirely by looking at racism and racial discrimination, but I think that's certainly a part of the reason why, especially why certain people are stuck in inner city ghettos and don't have access to better schools or better neighborhoods or to decent jobs. And so there's a sense of a legacy of struggle to achieve a society that's racially just, where people's life chances aren't really hindered or obstructed in any way because of their racial classification. And even though some of us, because of access to education and other kinds of opportunities, are able to flourish even despite the persistence of racism, some are held back more, partly because of they lack access to some of these opportunities. So I think that it's that the sense that there is, that part of the reason why some are being held back is because of racial injustice persists, is part of what ties us together and leads to these kinds of questions being raised.
There's also a practical aspect, which is that if you are part of the black underclass, if you are poor and black, the way we process race in our society today and the way we're often taught to process it is such that there's a sense of racial balkanization, which means that often really helping people is something best done by people who are also black. For example, here in Boston, I can't imagine Eugene Rivers' 10-point coalition working if Gene weren't black. No matter how well-intentioned he was, no matter how hip he was, as a white person, it wouldn't work as well. Because
Why?
He's dealing
Why? The idea of ministers going out, talking to young people, urging them not to get involved in crime. Why does race matter in that?
Because of the way he can talk to them. There is
What
a
does
certain
that mean?
safety.
His language?
No,
His
certainly
culture?
not. No, what he can say to them. They feel a safety with Gene because of one thing, the background that he can refer to, and because there's a certain immediate trust because he's processed as one of their own.
Unless he's Father Flager at St. Sabina's in Chicago, which is a black Catholic church, but you don't think of Catholic churches as mega churches. This is a 10,000-member, some thousand-member black Catholic church, and he's a white minister, and he's taking down posters of alcohol advertisements, and they're open to have it's one of these mega churches. They have daycare programs and a school and so on. And so I think it's a little more than his ability to affiliate and to find similarities between himself and the young people, although I don't at all discount that. I definitely think that there are whites who have been able to do incredible things in black communities around all kinds of issues with young people. But I think your question is really a normative one, and one that requires us to say, well, we just think black people should take responsibility take partial responsibility or do something about, participate in the improvement of the situation for blacks overall, but for blacks, disadvantaged African Americans in particular.
Let me throw some names out and get you to react in terms of whether these individuals are doing the sorts of things. You look at Minister Louis Farrakhan, taking people who were part of the black working class, black poor, and taking them from where they are to where they end up, employed, sober, disciplined, etc. And that's at least a symbolic example of somebody who says, my obligation is to lift up the least of these to something. Is that a model that's working?
Well, it seems to me that you've got to have a broad division of labor here. I mean, there are lots of different things people can do. Within the black community, there's these sorts of self-help measures, or group self-help measures, have been a big part of how you keep yourself from completely falling apart. And so helping, what the Nation of Islam in general, and Minister Farrakhan in particular, had focused on over the years are self-help measures, attempts to sort of help the worst off in the community to just be able to get by, have a sense of dignity, have a sense of pride, get off of drugs, stay out of prison, and so on. But that's one part of it, but it also seems to me that there's room for measures to have to do with opening the structure of opportunity. And people spend time doing those things, either through law or supporting candidates or running as a candidate you can push for things that could actually help people. So I think a combination of those sorts of group self-help measures plus actual sort of political activism aimed at changing laws, social structure, creating more opportunities. You need both those sorts of things, I think, to move forward.
Professor Mccorder, let me ask you a little bit about your example of Eugene Rivers. It's an example. Are you suggesting that the black community needs black people to lead them from where they are to where they need to go?
It doesn't have to be only black people, but the black-led organizations that are doing the sorts of things that Gene Rivers' organization is doing are having some really special results. There are a lot of organizations like that around the country, and it seems that sense of fellowship that is felt is an important thing. And also, in terms of it being normative, one of the reasons that I would urge middle-class black America to be more interested in those organizations is because it will give middle-class black America a sense of power over the situation. So, for example, Tommy, you mentioned that we need social legislation, we need the establishment to set a context for people to have opportunity. I agree, but it's clear that from administration to administration, it's hard to predict whether or not those contextual conditions are going to be in place. Sure. And so it seems to me that we might look more towards the things that we can do and that we have more control over and that might be more consistent. And just from what I've looked at, it is those black-led organizations that have a special power without discounting the exceptions. So that's why I say that I do see middle-class black America as having that responsibility.
Tell me, any of you, how this community would look. And that is, if the black community, the middle class, has some responsibility for the poor, describe in as concrete terms, if you can, what do you envision this community looking like looking forward?
But it already takes on that responsibility. And I think we too quickly, we very frequently talk about the lack of involvement of middle-class blacks or the lethargy among middle-class blacks or the lack of a sense of responsibility. But in survey after survey, Jennifer Hochschild's work and Kathy Cohen and Michael Dawson's work and people who do surveys of African Americans, they find that, in fact, more educated African Americans are more likely to be involved in any number of things, in community organizations, in church groups. They're more tied into black information sources, into black radio, into black newspapers. And in fact, when you ask specifically, do you feel like you have a responsibility for poor blacks? The majority of them say yes. And in fact, then they say, but we're not doing enough. I think that there's a fair sense of guilt among middle-class blacks. Despite their participation, they still feel even more responsibility. And I think that's where part of the reason for that is that the work is so big. There's so much to be done that the kind of measures that we can do at the community level, that we can do in our families and that we can do in our own social service and in our own monetary giving, really seem tiny compared to the larger things about inadequate health care and lack of employment and those kinds of things, which I think would be impossible for us to really get a handle on with our own participation, other than collective political movement.
But is it different? I'm thinking of the work Charles Hampton Houston did, the great lawyer who graduated from Harvard in the 1920s, going back to South Carolina, looking at the schools, describing the difference between the black schools and the white schools, getting very immersed in the poor community, try to lift them up for integration. I'm thinking of Dr. King, not just what he did in Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham, but what he did in Chicago and Detroit, going to working class people, trying to lift them up. To what extent is that evident today? There's an occasional march by Reverend Jesse Jackson, an occasional effort by Reverend Al Sharpton. When you think about it, are we really doing the mass effort to lift our community up? And the other thing, are we only doing things as a middle class that don't cost us much? Yes, we are disappointed we can't do more. It's overwhelming. The middle class blacks are as concerned about crime as whites. They want to live in a community.
More concerned.
They want
we're living in the neighborhood.
They want to go to the private schools, right? They want to get as far away from where they came as any other group. And so I'm trying to look at this sort of cognitive dissonance where we are saying we are concerned, but our actions, in a sense, speak louder than words, right? I mean, we're moving further away. We're becoming more distant. We're becoming less where we come from. And is that the problem? Not the poor blacks, but us. Are we the problem as opposed to the group we claim we're trying to help?
Go ahead.
I guess I worry about the model. I mean, you can have a model that's, it's the middle class or as the kind of black vanguard or something, we're there and we're trying to make things happen, pull the others along with us. And it seems to me that we should think a little bit differently about it, so that it's trying to, one of the things that you have amongst many working class and poor blacks is a complete disengagement from politics. Cynicism, apathy, not participating in electoral politics at all. And it seems to me that trying to energize and politicize and allow those who are the worst off to feel like they're having some control of their own situation, or it's not a matter of, those of us, pulling them along or trying to help them in various ways, right? I mean, I think that there's some of that to be done, and that's an important thing to do, but I think trying to break down the cynicism, the apathy, the sense of being completely estranged from the rest of the culture that you sometimes find in some black communities is something that will be a very important step in the right direction, rather than just continually emphasizing what is the middle class going to do to help bring the rest along.
See, this is what worries me, though. Let's say that we politicized the people who now tend not to vote. It depends on how you politicize, because if what the people were taught was to vote only for one party, then unfortunately it leaves the black American race the least powerful group in the country, because we don't split our vote. And so, for example, if we were going to politicize that class of person, I would hope that as many of them would vote Republican, which I have not yet. I'm not shilling for anybody, but I might. But I would hope
just to help the race.
It's important. It's very important that as many of them would vote Republican as Democratic, so that the parties would have a reason to compete. Because, frankly, Republicans have told me that there's only so much they can possibly come up with for people who they know will never vote for them. And Democrats won't tell you, but of course they don't have to work that hard, because we're a shoo-in. And in the meantime, as far as politicization goes, for example, take the idea that what we need is to create employment opportunities. Obviously, the system is not ideal for young black people who don't have a whole lot of education. And it's not as ideal as it was when you could go work at the Ford factory. But you find in study after study, and this is by people with completely good intentions and no political bias or a leftist political bias, that it's not only that there are no jobs, but that there are people who, because it's a culture they've grown up in where they haven't seen people working on a regular basis, are disinclined to find. I'm reading an anthology of articles about that right now. So I'm interested in the organizations because that can't be fixed by something that people do in the halls of Congress. We need to talk to people. We need to work with people. We need to show people the way. And it seems to me that that is a matter of face-to-face contact of a sort which we can do and therefore see that waiting for Washington to get wise again might not be necessary.
I think
We're going to be going to the audience for questions in just about 5 minutes. So if you have a question, you should line up at one of the microphones. We'll be with you in just a moment. Go ahead.
two points I would respond. One is there's definitely other levels, political levels, than the national political level, and I think many struggles are really fought at the local level. And when you think about at the local level, things like transformations of public housing, which is a huge thing going on across the country, but the families who have been moved out of places that are being demolished, even though this was coming from national policy, but it was enacted at the local level, there's been a real silence among public housing residents around the transformation of public housing across the country. So there, I think, are battles at the local level about funding for education at the state level, and these kinds of battles that wouldn't require the kind of split political party affiliation that you're suggesting. And the other thing I worry about in terms of, I agree with you, in terms of the model of leading people along is, as I just finished a research project on gentrification in Chicago, in particular black gentrification in Chicago. As middle and upper income African Americans move into this poor African American neighborhood, leading along really devalues, discounts, dismisses the kinds of interests of the people who live there. Mm-hmm. So the movement toward making the local public school a magnet school, which you have to test in to get in, and it's closed it off to many people who live there. Now it's a great public school, but nobody who lives there can get in, maybe and they haven't fixed the grammar schools that feed into the high school. So these kinds of things that I think often sound like very good interventions, the kind of leading along, I think, does not listen enough to the interests that people have that are different because of their class situation.
Well, let me just follow up on that particular point before I take the questions. That middle class person could say, you know what, the tough medicine is to have a better school, not to just have a school.
And that is what they say.
Du Bois told us in 1935, it's not integrated or segregated schools. We want a good education, right? And is that part of the tough love? My question was going to be, last question was, let's think about Katrina. That is, if the black middle class studied that very carefully and said, we've got two choices. One choice is to do as much as we can to make sure that all of those displaced residents of New Orleans are returned, no matter what. Or we can see an economic value to turning over the Ninth Ward to Donald Duck and Donald Trump for development, because that means we'll be able to hire, thousands of displaced folks to work, but they can't live there anymore. That is, there's an economic benefit if we take this route, and then there's sort of a more of a personal benefit if we say, you may not have a good quality of life, you may be subject to another levee breaking, but you're back home. What does the black middle class do? What's best for the community? Or should we even be in that business?
Bring them home. And the reason is because I have a real problem with an idea that we're often taught is enlightenment, which is that if you have a large group of people who are descendants of African slaves living in one place, and most of them are poor, that a complete disaster must occur. I find that the most ahistorical proposition. And I would love to see a place, not to use people who've had a terrible time as pawns. I'd like to see them have a good time in life. But to see a place, to see a rebuilt New Orleans where almost everybody is black, mostly working class and poor, and things are actually going rather well. If we could see that pre-1965 struggling but stable black community again, I would hope that it would turn around a lot of the pessimism that you see from a lot of quarters that I think keeps a lot of us from helping to make people's lives better.
But how could that, that's to me the crux of racism, that currently such a community can't exist. We know it can't exist. It doesn't exist. When communities are segregated or racially segregated or predominantly black, they are disinvested. Commercial enterprises won't come in. In fact, again, in Chicago, they just did a study of the location of grocery stores in the city. Places with exact same median family incomes that are predominantly white have, so many more grocery stores per capita than places that are predominantly black. So I agree with you. I agree with the premise 100%. But I think that's the struggle that needs to get us to the place to allow for such a thing to happen.
Quick comment, Professor Shelby, before you go on.
All I would say on this question is I think that, I agree, you don't want to have the picture of that you can have, a community of black people who are thriving, but, you do need jobs and good schools. So, if I say, yes, of course, I shouldn't say bring them back, they want to go back, create opportunities for them to do so, but also let it, when they go back, let there be jobs and better schools than what that were there before they were forced to leave, and then maybe you could see the thriving community that you.
Let me take the first question to the left and then to the right. Before I do that, please join me in thanking our panelists for their comments. And please identify yourself if you would.
Hi, I'm Crystal Fleming. I'm a second-year PhD student in sociology. Thank you guys so much for starting this conversation. My question is, given the fact that kind of the moral leverage for appealing to the state to kind of mobilize around social justice has eroded, given, Wilson's thesis about the declining significance of present-day racism, and also given the possibility that kind of problematizing poverty as a black issue is misleading and kind of perpetuates a negative and I think a negative image of our community, which has kind of causal mechanisms also for recreating inequality. Given those assumptions, why isn't it a better idea to kind of mobilize in an interracial coalition against poverty, which one would think would have both the effect of, in the long term, realizing social justice and possibly reducing racial stigma because you would have more racial justice?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'm not sure why you think you have to choose. I don't think there's any incompatibility between group-based struggles for social justice and where those groups, either as individuals or as a group, join forces with others who have similar goals. So, I think it's been that way for a very long time. I think the civil rights movement was very much like that. So I'm not sure why you feel like there needs to be a choice between either, a sort of black solidarity, political struggle for change, or interracial coalitions. It doesn't seem to me that that's a choice we have to make.
I'm going to take the next question up here. I want to announce as well that as soon as this forum ends, all of the panelists will be going to the Harvard Coop for a book signing. You can see the further detailed arguments in their books if you want to join us at 7:15. Yes, question up here? Yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Richard Reddick. I'm a doctoral student at the Graduate School of Education. My question has to do with the conversation that's sort of been based in discussing progress for African Americans from the perspective of contributing across classes. So looking at the middle class as a contributor to success for the working class and blacks in poverty. I wonder if we can complicate that a little bit and talk about the idea of complementarity and the idea that working class blacks, blacks in poverty, can actually inform and educate and assist middle class African Americans in our progress towards equality. So I want to know your thoughts on that thesis, and secondly, if you do believe or agree with that, could you give examples of how you see, for instance, blacks in poverty assisting or potentially assisting African Americans who are in middle class, or working class African Americans assisting blacks in the middle class? I think we have a responsibility to think about ourselves as being connected in so many ways. Dr. Portillo, you made this point about the fact that so many of us have, if not from those backgrounds, we actually have relatives in those backgrounds, and to sort of take the perspective that we can pass along information to those, quote unquote, lower than us, I think is problematic.
Mm-hmm. There's a conversation that I've missed, and I'm sincerely asking you, what's an example of how we could have that particular pathway of help the black poor helping the black middle class. What sort of thing were you referring to?
I'll give the example of John H. Jackson, who was the publisher of Jet. Very much a working class, possibly you could consider him black in poverty, coming from Arkansas to Chicago, and his own contributions, not being college educated, not having the social networks necessary, quote unquote, to start a journalism system himself, but he actually, basically found a way by working as a part of another organization, starting his own organization. And I just think that that's an example of one person. The other reality is that oftentimes those sort of situations are not highlighted. They're not interesting. They don't get those stories told. You look in the black church, you will find many examples of this happening person to person. My own experience teaching the inner city taught me that the black families I worked with, though I had more education than they did, taught me a lot about community sacrifice, the idea of unity, the idea of solidarity.
Now, see, that's just the thing. What you're talking about, I think, is a wonderful message. How do we have a race dialogue where that coexists with the other message, which is that white employers don't want to hire young black men for no good reason, that if the factory moves to the suburbs, then people don't have anywhere to work, and because there are no middle-class role models, what can you expect? Because we're often told that that's what we're supposed to be thinking about. So the stories like John Johnson's or any number of people who've risen from the very bottom are thought of, the usual term is anecdotal. And the other term is that ordinary people don't have any agency, as it's put. I'm not sure how you would countervail that wisdom with what you're saying without being accused of just telling just so stories.
I think some of those upward mobility stories definitely exist, if not so much in the scholarly work, surely in popular work. I mean, I think the black information sources are ones that give us and appropriately celebrate upward mobility stories. I was thinking somewhat in a different direction that I started to allude to thinking about gentrification, is that I think working class and poor blacks in the neighborhood that I study, for example, have a lot to contribute around pushing middle class blacks to keep on their agenda issues of economic justice, to keep middle class blacks from thinking in their economic self-interest only, even when their the policies they might put forth have serious negative repercussions for poor African Americans. That might be couched in a kind of racial collective language, but it often can have serious negative consequences. And when you listen to the voices of public housing residents, for example, who are working, and just as we know, when we think about the housing situation, to afford a two-bedroom apartment, and most people can't afford a two-bedroom apartment off of a working class, off of a minimum wage job. You have to have like 7 minimum wage jobs or something to afford a two-bedroom apartment. And to put that back onto the table for middle-class blacks, who I don't think always keep that front of mind, can make the conversation about public housing, for example, not about lazy people who want to milk the system and live in housing and not work, but it's about even people who are working in this era of welfare reform who still can't afford to live in the city. And I think bringing those kinds of arguments to the fore keeps black middle-class folks grounded in some way, but especially, I think, aware of economic injustice as much as they are aware of racial injustices.
Let me take the next question up here.
Hi, my name is Rabani Tremieu. I'm a master's student at the Graduate School of Education. My question has to do with, we've been talking a lot about the domestic issues concerning the black community. What do you think, has your study shown any acknowledgement of the black community in America as seeing itself as part of a greater international community of black people? And also, do you see that as a valuable potential solution to strengthening the black community in America, to strengthen the community of people of color abroad?
Anyone want to take that?
I'll jump in if you like. I wouldn't say that, there certainly are connections, partly because a big part of the greater black community are from other parts of the world. So there are connections that are there already built in a way. But and I think there are various ways that American citizens in general can help blacks living in other parts of the world, especially when they're living in parts of the world where they're deeply impoverished. But there are real limitations there too. That is, I mean, within scholarship now, especially within African American studies, or broadly conceived, is a lot of focus on diaspora and a lot of focus on Black internationalism. And I think that's an important thing to emphasize. But one of the things that happens is sometimes people don't point out, a very obvious thing, is that, well, there's a big difference what you can do politically when you're a member of a society and you can vote and you pay taxes and you can run for office. When you have standing before your government, it's very different, when you are not a member of another society. There are limitations. So I think that there are certain lots of things that can be done, but I think that disanalogy, it makes it hard you have to have a different model of Black politics when you're thinking transnationally in this way than when you're thinking about it domestically.
Well, there's another aspect that we've sort of passed too quickly when we talk about the Black community. It's not monolithic. Right? If you look here at Harvard University 50 years ago or 40 years ago, the Black community was African American. I mean, people whose parents and they were born in the United States. And you look today, it is a group that very much reflects the diaspora. And there's no monolithic thinking, right? And someone from New Guinea or from Ethiopia or from Nigeria may be different than someone from Harlem or South Central Los Angeles or Jamaica or Haiti or Brazil or Venezuela. And to what extent is all of this a little bit dangerous in trying to make an assumption about the Black community when it doesn't really exist, does it?
It's very important to acknowledge that there has been a diaspora and that there are things in common. But what worries me is that sometimes the problems can be so very different. And I'm not sure if they all lend themselves to one paradigm along the lines of oppression. Or if that's true, how can you activize that in the real world? So, for example, people are being chased out of their homes and hacked to bits in Sudan. And that's based on a certain configuration of power, which is unfortunate. And then in the meantime, you have the things that are going on in Zimbabwe and in Swaziland. You have a very different set of problems in Ethiopia. And then, good Lord, look what's happening to Ghana, which hasn't realized its potential. Then here, we have, say, a woman who has passed her 5-year welfare cap and has some kids and is trying to make the best of herself, and how do we help her? Those are such different things. And so in terms of actually helping people within a relatively compact amount of time, I have a hard time translating the diaspora into activism without meaning to dismiss the diaspora itself.
Next question right here.
How are you? Omar Abdul Malik. I'm a research fellow in Islamic Studies with the Pluralism Project and the Sackler Museum. My question has to do with culture. The Black post-war, World War II generation created a culture that rewarded and the creation and accumulation of human and financial capital. And that culture was manifested in just kind of anecdotal things like you have to be twice as good to go half as far, you should be a credit to your race and things of that nature. As a matter of fact, it made it so that it was very hip to be smart and progressive. And it didn't really matter how poor you were. When I grew up, there were people who lived in public housing with some of the most brilliant students, so the biggest credits to their race. And my question to you is, what happened to that culture? And did religion have a role in its creation and its demise? And did the government have a role in its creation and its demise? 5 words or less.
I can say a little bit. Try to take a piece of that. I think that on the education question about how we think about education, part of the difficulty is that I think that so many people think of education as only a means to a job or to money. And I think that if you were, growing up in a very disadvantaged household or community, and you are only thinking about how the education is the key to something else, you might be discouraged because you might think that the outcomes are not likely to be what you would want if you were to put in this time studying or working
people do
hard.
things every
But it seems to me that if you refocus someone and you think about education as something that has intrinsic value, I mean, cultivating your mind, learning about the world. So, I mean, yes, I mean, it can be a means to something else. But I think if we emphasize the ways in which ideas, knowledge, developing your critical skills, that's something that's important to have, regardless of what the payoff is for it. That would be, I think, a big step forward.
Yeah, right. Well, let me just I agree with everything you're saying, and I think that people back then didn't even have the kind of concepts of success that people. I mean, people were talking about, I want a nice apartment, I want a Ford or a Chevy. People weren't talking about a Bentley or platinum teeth. I mean, they're talking about just living a good civilized life. And what I'm saying is that existed when I grew up in the 50s. And
let me
the
just
60s,
respond,
and
Omar.
I want to know what happened to that.
It existed because that's the only opportunity that was available. You couldn't have a Bentley. You can only have a Model T, right? I mean, you couldn't rise above it. And
Nobody had.
One of the amazing consequences of Brown, I've written and talked about this, is that there were costs associated with integration, and they were major costs. Huge impact on the black community in the sense that some were able to leave, many were left behind. That was the impact, right? The upward mobility. And the idea is that if now you can go to a quality institution, get an education, get a better job, that's success, isn't it? Well, it is in one sense, but it means that you moved away from that community, away from those values. And the same thing with the church. I mean, if you think about the idea of a church in Dr. King's era and the idea of the mega churches today, you think of, I can't remember his name, the money guy from, no, the old one from New York.
Abyssinia?
The whole idea is that the church was about money.
Reverend Ike.
What could be better than raising, getting money? Reverend Ike.
Yeah.
Reverend Ike. Right. Okay. I mean, just that whole sense. There's a whole different concept what the community's about, and now the mega churches are where the black middle class largely go, and they're very profitable. But to what extent are they connected in the struggle that we've been talking about of lifting up the bottom, as opposed to saying, you should be able to lift yourself up, individualism, and they have much more appeal.
Do they say you should be able to lift yourself up, or lifting yourself up is a good goal? I don't see it so much. The mega churches, the ones that I'm familiar with, again, have a number of programs, both within their churches and reaching outside of their churches, to assist people in lifting themselves up. It's not appointing you should do this, but we should lift ourselves up, and so let's do this. So in that respect, I don't see the black mega churches as places of disengagement, but in fact, engagement, one of the sites of engagement. And I think I have the tendency, and it's perhaps because I don't really know what the post-World War II generation looked like, because it's not my generation, but from my reading of history, I think I have the tendency to see the similarities, to see the continuities, and to, for example, if we look at while the test score gap remains an issue that we need to address, African Americans have been closing the gap on test scores, and in fact, greater percentage of them now graduate from high school than in previous eras. Again, there's a long way to go, but I guess I see us continuing on this work rather than wanting to recreate something that existed before that I think had its challenges and its problems at that time.
Next question.
Kwame Zulu Shabazz, social anthropology and a foot soldier in the struggle. My question is for Jonathan McWhorter. I followed your work for some time now, and frankly, I'm a bit confused because as I followed your work and read your editorials and listened to you on NPR and read your books, I always find myself saying, how could a brother say that? How could a black man, how could a black scholar say those things? But as I listen to you up here, you sound very reasonable. And so I'm really confused. I want to give you the opportunity to be yourself. If you could just sketch out what it means to be a black conservative for us briefly.
What you're seeing is the fact that when people such as yourself call me a black conservative because I don't think that there should be a such thing as racial preferences in higher education, that it's actually something of an oversimplification. I'm not a conservative. I'm a centrist person politically. Most of my views socially fit right in with what's considered PC. And I think I got a certain amount of attention for that one particular educational point because the atmosphere was rather ripe for it in the year 2000. But in terms of what I'm about, I'm trying to help people. Now, I think that some of the attitudes that we're often told are correct in trying to help people are not what I would say. And my job is just to try to make sense of things. But this is me. I've always been the same.
Next question.
Chris Carter, I'm a second year here at the Kennedy School. I guess what I've heard is that there's this narrative that black children, namely, are given when they're young, and I guess over time we're fed this narrative that, oppression is out there, that there are all these forces. So what do you each see as the proper narrative, perhaps, if that narrative doesn't work or if that story doesn't work? One thing that I've grappled with is how, when I have children, not if, but when I have children, how I plan to deal with things like the N-word if my son or daughter comes home. These are very personal things. It's not on the level of trying to save the entire black race, but what is the narrative that you believe should be propagated?
I'm not good on that one because I don't have kids yet.
I don't have kids either.
But Lord,
if that can be our out.
Right. The question is, what's going to happen? I have a vision. I'll be, in my early 50s, and my little girl is going to come home, and she's going to say some stuff that I don't agree with, or my boy is going to use the N-word. I'm still thinking about that because I know it's going to happen. Peers are what affect people more than parents. It's a tough one. I don't know what that narrative is going to be. Family's hard. You have to have one.
Well, I am a parent and a grandparent, and I've been preaching about the N-word since my children were born. And I'll make sure that my grandchildren understand it as well. I don't think it's a conflict at all, that it has been used in such derogatory terms and demeaning terms. And the last thing I want is someone I care about to be in a situation in first grade and to have a word used. Because it happened to me when I was a kid in school, but I understood from my grandparents and my parents how demeaning it was. So to me, it's not even a debate. So I think we do have to affirmatively create the narrative. We can't just, let's wait and see what happens. I think the costs are too great. It was very interesting. When I would do a lot of professional lectures when my son was a teenager, he was a night walker. So we'd be in these very fancy hotels in Miami or Chicago or somewhere, and he would walk, go out because he didn't want to go to bed. And then I get a call, sir, there's a young black man who says he's your son. Can we let him up, right? And so for him, he was oblivious to the fact that race mattered. It was just somebody who was young, but in fact, he, dressed the way he was, gave off those things. So I think that we have to be affirmative and preemptive in trying to make sure that we create a narrative that makes sense for our communities. Because if we don't, they could learn the hard lessons, and it could be very counterproductive and very destructive of what we're trying to create. Yes, next question.
Good evening. I'm Jay Lundy, a freshman here at the college, and my question has to do with the political future of blacks in America. Within the Latino population here in America, once a Democratic stronghold, there has become some split with, socioeconomic elite, the Cubans, and others, and the lower class in voting with the Cubans, Republican Party, and some of the lower classes still with the Democratic Party. Within the African American communities here in America, do you see any sense of maybe some kind of switch with upper class blacks moving to the Republican Party and lower class sticking with the Democratic Party? And if not, do you see it based on maybe what type of black you are? Maybe Africans voting one way, or Caribbean blacks another way, or African Americans who have struggled here in America for hundreds of years voting another way?
It's very difficult to predict. We certainly are seeing a larger number of blacks voting Republican in the last election. At least the numbers I've seen suggest close to 10%. And I expect that, blacks are not we don't share the same political ideology. I mean, there are issues that we often unify around, and we disagree often on how to address them, but we often agree on what they are. And so I would expect probably more, if you like, political differentiation within the larger communities, but it's hard to predict which directions they will go. I wouldn't say that you can predict based on, national origin or class alone. I mean, because there are plenty of people who would go the other way. So, but I do expect greater differentiation along with respect to the two major parties.
Let me just make a quick comment. I really don't think it's along class lines or age lines in a general sense that, the wealthier you are, the more likely to be Republican, or the poorer you are, the more likely to be Democratic. I think it's more personal than that. But it's very interesting when I saw in the 2004 election a massive effort to get young voters out, registered to vote, and the presumption, which is entirely wrong, that if you're young and you're a person of color, you're going to vote Democratic. That was not the case. There was an assumption, but there were things that appealed to young, diverse voters. They were concerned about whether or not they were getting benefits because of their merits or because of affirmative action. They were intrigued by the idea of being able to invest their Social Security funds in ways that might be able to increase their wealth. So there's a whole assumption that if you're young and you're black, you're going to vote Democratic, but you're young and you're black, you're looking for the best message. And in that voting booth, the best message might have been, surprising to others of us, was the message of Republicans. And so your generation will be very critical, and I think, of what direction we take in the 21st century, because you're, in a sense, independent of the political process now and have a lot of discretion to decide one way or the other. I think we've run out of time. I'm going to just take these two questions together, and then we'll answer them with our final comments. Just if you guys give your question and your question, just those two. Yes.
Hi, I'm Zia Kocha. I'm a sophomore in the college biochemistry concentrator, and I'm a first-generation Nigerian immigrant, and I've experienced firsthand the divisions between the African-American community and also the African immigrant community, and I was just wondering how important it was to unify the black community in that sense, if that's something that we should even be looking at now, or what your comments are on that. So.
Okay, now the last question.
My name is Christina Hemphill, and I'm a master's student at the School of Public Health and Environmental Health. And I've worked in the past in environmental justice and organizing, and worked a lot on housing, transportation, health issues, and really looking at how institutional policies really affect the choices that people have been able to make in regards to their environment. And so I wanted to know, for the three of you, well, actually for the four of you, what portion of the responsibility for poverty, disempowerment, health, do you think, in the black community, do you think lies in personal choices, and how much lies in institutional policies? And how should we best put our efforts in terms of efforts into individual empowerment, into community-based building, or into institutional change in order to solve these exact problems?
Okay, so there are two questions on the table, one about the likelihood of some greater unity among people of African descent throughout the diaspora, and about the issues of health. Is it choice or is it imposed externally? Who wants to take either one of those?
These are our final.
Yes.
I'll make my final statement. On Africans and African Americans, black Americans I prefer to say now actually, I think that it's very important for there to be constant dialogue between the two, because it's clear that there is racism. There is institutional racism, there's societal racism, there's white privilege and all of these things. But I think too often we're taught that those things are more obstacles to success than they are. And I think that to the extent that African immigrants experience racism, sometimes of the most graphic kind, and all of the discrimination that you can talk about, and yet succeed, I always think that this would be a positive role model. And now that we are 41 years after the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, we have generations deep of people of that extraction. The standard answer is to say that immigrants have a special pluck and we can't compare ourselves to them. I think that's harder to say when you're dealing with someone face to face and you see this is a person, they opened a store. How can I open a store? This is a person, I'm at Harvard, my parents ran a restaurant. how can I do that, or something like that. And then on the issue of health, obviously it goes both ways. There are institutionalized discrepancies in healthcare, so that African Americans, you have me doing it again, Black Americans end up getting inferior care. On the other hand, I think to really save Black America, we also have to realize that you can mention that there's a culture internal factor without meaning it in condemnation. And there are dietary issues. I've seen it in my own family. I have to control it for myself sometimes. And so to an extent, and I think I'm not supposed to say this. This is me as the conservative. I don't think that it's about supermarkets in the neighborhood as often as we're told. This is something I've been looking at lately. Often it's that you've been taught to eat in a certain way. And so you can tell somebody, here are ways to make the same food in a different way. Here are things that you might want to try eating. That, of course, has to be done gently, and it's not the whole solution. But I think it's both things.
Any other quick comments from either?
Yeah, I'm definitely probably more of a structuralist than a culturalist. And, just to stick on the grocery store thing, I was just in Cub Foods on 87th Street in Chicago, which doesn't mean anything to you all, but that's the south side of Chicago, which is majority Black. And the fruit and vegetable section was awful.
Right.
And, so I see those kinds of differences, and the fact, first of all, the big grocery stores aren't there as much, and you have the smaller corner grocery stores that really affect decisions. And, in sociology, we often talk about, is culture really just an adaptation to structure? And even if Blacks have been taught to eat in the way that we do, that was in response to the kinds of things that we were given to eat. So I see a historical legacy that have shaped the choices that African Americans make, and I see a continuing landscape that shapes choices. That doesn't mean that there is nothing that we should embrace that we could change. And I think some of the work that Patti LaBelle does in putting her cookbooks for diabetics out there are important things to do. And I think we can embrace those. But if you don't have anywhere to buy your fresh vegetables, and if your air is polluted and your landlord doesn't change the lead paint, then you're kind of still constrained.
Yeah, I don't think I would disagree with any of those kind of things about the health question. I mean, it does seem to me, there is sometimes I don't know whether this is just a matter of watching too many movies and television, but there's a perception that amongst Black Americans that that our family is organized around eating, and I don't know if that's true. Mine is like that, but I don't know if others are like that. And so there are some things that some choices that we make, and people are informed about the consequences that will have. That I think that's fine. But it does seem to me that having a decent grocery store near you and having the money to be able to buy the things that are better for you makes a big difference. On the question of the diversity of the Black population, part of what I think about that is sometimes we try to make Black political solidarity do too much. I think that it can't be all of our politics. It's a part of my politics, but it's not all of my politics, And I think to the extent that we try to create too much internal cohesion, I think this is self-defeating, because there are differences, there are conflicts of interest on some issues, and sharp disagreements about a range of political issues. And so expecting great cohesion around everything is probably a mistake. But one of the things we can do is be somewhat more tolerant about different ways of being Black, from national origin to ethnicity to other choices that people make and how they enact their Blackness, as it were, or distance themselves from it, as the case may be. And that enables, I think, more dialogue across these differences if we don't think that what we have to do is level them or make us all the same in order for us to be able to do some things constructively together.
My final point is that I think we very much need to be more united, even as we allow our differences to be reflected. And the examples that lead me to that conclusion are Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo. Those were two individuals who, from every sense of the word, they were not Americans, African Americans. They were from another place. But in the moment of crisis, they were seen and viewed as Black. That's what mattered. And so there was something healthy out of that. in the sense that they were victims in spite of being somebody different. And the irony of the reason I talk about this even though difference, when I'm in New York City or Chicago or Washington, D.C. or Boston, the people who are least likely to stop for me in a cab, no matter how nice I'm dressed, are people from the diaspora. Because I must be one of those black ones, which means something special, even in our community, which is different. They don't stop and say, oh, that might be a Nigerian, or that might be a brother from Haiti. It's that, that's one of those guys from Roxbury or Dorchester, Mattapan, or from Harlem, or from Southeast Washington, D.C. So there's a lot of internal conflict within our community, and I think we need to find a way to address it, not by having 13,000 organizations at the college with every little group of different color, but to think about it in a unified way. And it goes to the same question of health. I mean, everybody's right here. I mean, there's an institutional problem with the disparities in health, but we can't talk about the institutional racism without talking about personal responsibility. And if we aren't prepared to balance those two things, then we will suffer as fools for not being able to achieve some of our own, in a sense, success from these things that bring us down. I want you to join me and thank our panelists for just a very stimulating conversation on it. And as I said, they're all heading over to the Harvard Coop. You'll be able to talk with them and get their books signed. Thank you for coming again tonight.